This is the video of the second regulations meeting on the topic of the court sustaining the CTA's appeal of Contractor Storage Yard Regulations Amendment. On May 10th, the court found that the actions of the Commission was invalid because of Carl Neary's participation in public hearings and deliberations. That participation undermined the fairness and impartiality of the proceedings. The court sustained the CTA's appeal and invalidated the Commission's decision amending the regulations. The Regulations Committee met on May 22nd, and the video of that meeting is available on YouTube as well. On advice of counsel, the CTA hired Brian Miller of Turner Miller Group, New England, as an expert to help arrive at mutually acceptable solution and successfully press for effective and fair enforcement of regulations relating to contractors' storage yards and residential neighbors. This is a video of that second meeting held on July 24th. Action?
Well, folks, in pursuit of fairness, I try to get some of the contractors' yards operators here. I made a direct contact with several of them, and or their representatives, their attorneys, and they're not here, so they don't get a chance to have any input. I mean, that was the whole purpose of inviting them. You guys had a chance to express your views, and I thought I would, the idea was to hear from both sides and see if we could find a position. So we're going to have to proceed in their best interest as well as in your best interest. Let me just back up a little bit and fill you in what I've been doing. I've been looking at other classes of uses where there are problems of people basically conforming with the regulations they were approved under. And I requested our consulting planner to look at that, and so far I have no response from him regarding other uses. I got in touch with him directly after the meeting over a month ago.
Is this John? This is John Gazowski.
Yeah,
I just was curious. Do you know John Gazowski?
I've met him.
Yeah, okay. I just wondered if I figured Brian would.
We've sort of identified a couple of areas. We've been looking for areas where inspection is really necessary. My takeaway from our last meeting was that the issues really focused more on compliance with existing regulations than compliance with and developing new regulations right now. We're back past the regulations that were struck down by the court, so we're back to the old regulations. We haven't even approached that yet because I felt the imperative of compliance, and it's not something that I alone have brought up. It's been a consistent issue at the board. We thought we were planning and zoning, but somehow we've never had a staff that did a good job with compliance, and we obviously have to get that. But we also need regulations. We need to put some teeth into compliance. And part of the problem is, and I addressed it in an email that I wrote, but I didn't send it to everybody. Part of the problem is that we have uses that predate zoning. We have uses under 3 different variations of contractor yard regulations. And so in order to enforce, we have to have information as to what we can enforce. And all we can enforce is either those regulations or blight regulations. And unfortunately, as you probably know, the blight regulations don't have much teeth in them. So what I've been doing is looking for examples in Connecticut where they utilize secondary regulations, not necessarily the zoning regulations. For example, a lot of places stockpile materials. Well, a lot of towns have licensing or permitting for stockpiling. So you can have a town ordinance that requires a permit to stockpile. And the permit asks for a declaration of how high you want the stockpile, how big you want the stockpile to be, and there's inspection. You have to comply with that ordinance. And you see, the problem is we have different regulations for different yards, and they're not very strong in terms of what they can look at. They can look at, the buffer, the fencing, and things like that, but they don't get at the inherent problem, which is increasing stockpiling.
Or turning it into a junkyard.
Turning into a junkyard, but doing certain specific things like unregistered vehicles. You can control the number of unregistered vehicles. So you're looking at other uses. You see that, well, there are situations where there are automotive facilities that exceed what they declared would be the limit, and they are often asked to declare limits on how many unregistered cars they would have on the premises. Well, there are places that violate that. So what I'm trying to do now is compile a list of areas that are regulatable, not only by zoning, but also by local ordinance. And we don't have really any local ordinances. And when you get into this, and I've been bringing this up at the our regional planning association, because there are other towns that have similar problems. Sometimes they're not so much sometimes they're stockpiling, sometimes they're extraction problems. There's an area in East Hampton where there are approved excavating, stone or sand facilities. East Hampton is where the Connecticut River is narrowest, and the whole west side of East Hampton is sand that's been dropped out of the Connecticut River. Sand is a very valuable commodity these days, so there are people who basically get zoning for construction. They say that they're going to excavate sand to enable them to put in a septic system. They never build a building. They excavate up to 70 feet stacks of sand, and it was never a permitted activity. And they're just working on a new ordinance that would allow the increments of excavation to go up to the point where they're looking at like 5,000 truckloads of sand a year to be moved through the community. That's a lot of trucks. So I think getting to the point that we need to be is kind of tricky business, and frankly, we have to look at a lot of more uses, because then we'll identify the problem areas. But we're trying to address the inspection question, and I'd really like to hear from you on the nature of the problems. I know equipment. I've actually asked the question of the consultants about the cranes, because there seem to be no requirements in any case that the cranes have to be kept horizontal. They just keep the cranes vertically. I don't know what the justification for is, but technically they can be in violation of height limitations, and I know that's an issue that you guys face. And I want to identify those sort of sub-issues so we can find a way to deal with them.
Well, I've got some things that I want to show you, but I actually would like to defer to Brian, because we have retained him to be able to help us get through this. So I want him to talk to you guys if that's all right with you guys.
You're welcome.
Okay. I'm Brian Miller. I've been a planning and land use consultant for over 40 years, over 30 of them here in Connecticut. I've worked in 4 municipalities as a consultant for the municipality and as a consultant across the table from municipalities. When I first heard, well, first of all, you know, I think the concept that you have about that there's other potentially adverse impacting uses it is a valid kind of category to start putting things in, because you know that isn't unusual. Every town that I've ever worked with, they each have their own little thing going on. You know, there was one town in northern New Haven County that had a problem with quarrying and excavation, and that situation you described, I could tell you some horror stories on that one too. And actually grading, we've worked that stuff out. You also have a problem, you know, livestock, particularly in rural towns, that used to get a lot of subdivision activity, junkyards, truck terminals. You know, there's these range of uses, and each town has its own little bugaboo in there. And most of the towns, they share a common thread in how they treat it. Is you could look at, and even your zoning regulations have it to some extent, special uses or some category like that. And they might have some commonalities, but they also need some specifics for each of these uses. For example, quarrying, you're worried about grades and drainage all the time, and time limits and truck traffic. In construction yards, there's a different set of concerns, even though you could kind of build it into that whole regulatory apparatus. Frankly, I've been doing this for a long time, and I've never encountered a town that has such contentiousness going on about construction yards. And most of the communities I work with have a couple, and ideally, some of them have been there for a long time. Some of them are smaller, so you don't have a lot of storage of, you know, material. Some of them, though, they do have a lot of material that they store. And what we find is that works best if it's a larger piece of property. But most of the time, they're a couple of acres, they're not a big operation, and they're in an industrial area, and they're surrounded by industrial uses. And that's ideal. And the construction yards don't necessarily want to go near residential, because they're a big pain and people complain. You've heard a lot of the potential impacts. It's blighting, there's environmental impacts that could result from old machinery, or if you're storing some materials or fuel or anything like that. And from what I understand, that's been one area that has not had terrific enforcement. Now for that, you could also go to wetlands too, because most communities, you're never far from a wetland, and I'm sure that's true here as well. They're blighting influence, or they can be blighting influences, and some of the pictures I saw, that might be, that certainly would be a blighting influence. You kind of picture how would I like to live near that, or even have a different type of business. Visual impact, and that seems to be a very key one here too, and you have to deal with elevation. Your idea about the coming in and saying, well, we're going to store here, and the maximum height of the pile is going to be 7 feet, and that's what it is. And then you have a specific thing for the for the zoning officer to come in and look at. And you could do that for other things there. You could limit the equipment. You could say that the equipment's only going to be stored here under those circumstances. You could say that, you could certainly talk about whether vehicles are registered or not. And because, you know, you have, as you know, a bunch of unregistered vehicles and it becomes a junkyard. So you could act, if you tighten down when somebody comes in and gets a permit and they just show the building and some space where they're gonna, they call it outside storage, that's not sufficient. Also the placement of these things is that, you know, if they're gonna be right up against a residential property, that's problematic. The whole visual aspects, when you have difference in elevation, that has to be assessed. So when you go on the application side, you have to be pickier, and you put more of a burden, I guess, on the applicant to do this and demonstrate that this is going to be useful for the communities. Now, I know you have an inoperable equipment too, and you know, people are, I'm lazy a lot, and people are lazy, and if you got a corner of the yard and they're taking pieces of this equipment, dismantling this equipment and putting on another equipment, you know, and it starts becoming a junkyard. You know, or what they call them now, recycling centers. Now a junkyard, I like calling them junkyards. It's reminiscent when you need a part for a car and you go in there and look around. But a junkyard is something that obviously has become much more controlled. I mean, even the state likes to control it. Now, one of the things that a neighboring community is doing is that they're taking the category of junkyard and applying it wherever junk is. So by definition, if you have refuse, and it's more detailed than I'm describing, if you have refuse hanging around, it's a junkyard. It's not a contractor's yard. It's not a restaurant yard. It's not somebody's backyard. It's a junkyard. So you can actually...
And Brian, this is Westbrook that you're talking about.
It is Westbrook. Their regulations are very new, by the way. So I don't know if they've had a lot of test rides on it. But it's a good approach. And you could do that in other ways as well when you're dividing excavation and things like that. But I think for this one, that's a particularly valuable one. Now, the other problem that I've heard this frequently, I guess, is the problem of enforcement. Zoning enforcement can be a very cumbersome, time-consuming thing, even if there's vigilance attached to it. One way that you could do that is I don't know, you're probably aware of the stipulation in state statutes that enables basically people to write $100 a day fines, which can speed things up. I mean, $100 a day does add up, but at the same time, you know, a zoning enforcement officer doesn't feel too bad about slapping one on and kind of waking up the offending property owner. So it could deal with small situations. The other thing is the ordinance. Your blight regulations, I believe, are an ordinance. Now, they usually are. Well, you're right, they don't really deal with this situation. But you could tailor them to deal with all sorts of situations, and that has the real benefit of ongoing regulation. And you could also do kind of licensing of certain uses as well. For example, if you license the contractor yards, and that they, you know, it's an annual license, and the cost of the license is irrelevant. but that it's also accompanied by annual, biannual, organized inspections. And you get the zoning officer together with the, somebody from the health department or health district, whatever you use here, somebody from the fire marshal, and somebody from wetlands maybe, to go and do these regular inspections. And even if it's an existing use, if it's become, if it's departed from good standards of maintenance, let me put it that way, and it has junk all over it, and it's got more vehicles than were originally licensed, you could do that as well. So, I mean, I think, you know, and there's other things also, you know, when you're locating, keep them away from residential properties. INC allowing 3 zones, the two industrial and a business zone. Well, sometimes you also put an additional requirement that it has to be X hundred feet away, or a quarter mile away, or whatever it is, 300 feet, 500 feet. You can also, the visual impact, that seems to be a big problem. You can require that as part of even the licensing and the procedure. Because if it's blighting, it's a great term because it's so inclusive. It involves health, safety, property values, living environment, community environment, and they're all valid policing powers. But the zoning is also important, and it's all kind of needs to mesh together. And I think particularly where you have somewhat of an unusual problem with the contractors' yards, you know, I think you hit my approach would be hitting the worst problem first. If you don't have a lot of quarrying going on here, you don't have to worry about it. The original licensing approach, the first time I dealt with it was probably about 25 years ago with adult entertainment establishments. Before there was an internet, it was with the town of Berlin. I was a planner there. I don't know if you remember Berlin from the old days. Somebody does. The Berlin Turnpike was just, you know,
It's changed.
Well, it's changed because they started licensing it, and when a project was working, somebody had a bar, and they had a guitar player there, and they decided to change the entertainment to naked women, and some pastor. I mean, it was a big deal, but the zoning alone wasn't working on that. They had to have a regulation, that the seats have to be so far from the bar, that type of thing, or from the stage. This is the type of detail that you would want to get into. Because a contractor yard is also, it's almost like you know it when you see it, because there's all different types. There's from, you know, the one guy carpenter contractor, who has a pickup truck, stores some wood and occasional stuff, to, you know, kind of these encompassing ones. They do landscaping, paving, and whatnot, and they have big equipment, and they have big piles. So you need to put all these different measures in. And again, I think if you start maybe with that problem, and then when you address that problem, you could start using it for whatever your other secondary issue is. I'm not sure what it is. I'm sure it's not your vineyard or anything, but you know, whatever it is, you start with the thing that bothers everybody the most, and that's why, like the town of Oxford is doing the gravel pits all over the place, and so we figured out a way to control that. So anyway, I've talked probably too much, but
No, that's good.
but I'm happy to kind of answer questions.
What you've described is 2 problems. One is the zoning problem,
Right.
which reflects a lack of planning. And the second one is really the fact that, you know, we have a lot of these uses, and we have problems with They, as you say, they tend not to be good neighbors, but they're there, they are neighbors. And, you know, everything that I've heard leans towards the licensing, everything that I've seen really leans towards a licensing approach. I don't know.
Where do you stop, though? We have so many use groups. If you do it, we can't single out a use group and say, you're bad, you need to be licensed. We got a lot of use groups that have the potential to have violations and blight.
Well, what if we have, what I wanted to, and I brought some samples, and I have to tell you right now, we have tons of photography to show the actual devastation to neighborhoods by blight. So, I mean, you have to take it by a case-by-case basis, because unfortunately, some of these locations have been plunked down right in the middle of residential areas, and they were residential before, they were industrial in some cases. And so, I mean, you know, you have to start looking at what the situation is. I mean, I've got 5, 6 different things to show you right now. And I mean, I can on and on. And the other thing that's important too is that, and I don't have that one particular photograph that I thought I did have, but I could use the example, because I was involved with the situation on Meadow Road when they wanted to put the chipping into the situation. You know, in these yards, these pictures that I can show you, these yards existed when zoning was in, and it had the old zoning regulation, and they don't even comply with the old zoning regulation. So, I mean, you do have in existence that have not complied, that are not compliant even if you just went back to the other one. Whether it be spillage, or whether it be vehicles, or whether it be, and let me just, I just want to give you some
Enforcement.
pictures. I mean,
Probably our biggest problem with enforcement right now is we have nobody to do it. So we need to hire
just
that
because we
person.
don't have somebody.
Well, I
to do
think
it
that's
doesn't mean,
certainly
you know,
the
not
place to start.
represent. But look at this. This has grown into a situation
If we
where,
don't physically have a person to do it, we can't. We struggle. That's one of our biggest issues right now is getting a permanent CEO hired.
this is another example, and this was, again, when this particular building was built, there was not supposed to be any outside storage, any stockpile, anything. These are homes. That's that home. This is the backyard fence of that home that looks the back of that building, and when there's no trees, that's what they see. I mean, this, I could go on and on. This is something where we've got this situation here, over on Meadow Road, where I mean, this is the river back here. This is all wetlands. Are these vehicles drained, or what's going on here? Besides the fact there's a tremendous amount of garbage, and not garbage, it's metal and all kinds of things. None of this has been addressed, and some of this was addressed. I've been on the Planning and Zoning Commission, as you gentlemen know before, and I also was involved in some of the things regarding, in this situation, the fence has never been fixed. The fence is supposed to be at least a 6-foot high fence, and it's all broken down, and they were supposed to fix it. They didn't do it, okay? Because you're right, nobody enforced it, you're absolutely right. This is the natal property on the Nod Place. That's the barrier between, and it may even be on the natal property itself, that's the barrier between this contractor storage yard, which has equipment that's been sitting there. This picture is at least 2 to 3 years old, and current pictures, it's just the same, if not worse. So, I mean, to say, well, we don't have anybody to do anything about it, I don't think that's the answer. And I can provide you with tons of photography going back and forward and showing you where nothing is done. It just gets worse and worse and worse.
Mr. Kravitz, if I could, the reason that we're here is because you passed an amendment to a zoning regulation that someone was trying to enforce. The ZEO was trying to enforce that. And the way it was dealt with was, when it wasn't popular with somebody who was politically powerful, was to amend that to amend the regulation so that the person would become compliant, not by changing what they were doing, but by changing the regulation. And the reason you don't have a zoning enforcement officer is because politically powerful people can be very tough on these guys. And it's, you really do need to stand behind your CEOs. And if you have people on planning and zoning who are belligerent or who are misbehaving, at some point, planning and zoning needs to rein them in and ask them. And I know you can't force people to recuse themselves, but you certainly can prevent them from being belligerent to people when they're speaking. And that was part of the problem that you had in this case, and that's one of the reasons I think the judge sent this back. Now we have an opportunity that had that person not misbehaved, we probably wouldn't have been able to bring it back if it had been done, properly and without, that kind of blatant kind of belligerence. The other thing is, I might remind you, is in 2014, the town did pass a zoning citation ordinance, which does permit citations, and it includes junkyards. And I think one of the things that you have here with your contractor storage yards is that they have evolved.
Citations for violations of zoning regulations.
And that they have, and maybe it's really devolved, they've devolved into junkyards as defined by state statute. And when they become a junkyard, then those citations need to go into place. And you can't and I don't know how you stop it, but you've got to make the CEO understand that you're standing behind him or her against political powerful people, who are going to put undue pressure on them. And that is just not the way it's supposed to be. And the interesting thing, I think if many of these contractors, if their homes were next to that storage yard, I mean, they would not be happy with it. And it's just a golden rule. Do in your storage yard what you would be comfortable doing there if your home was right next door to it. On your issue about the cranes, I think there is a 35-foot height limit on buildings. I just don't know why that wouldn't apply to cranes that go up, in some cases, hundreds of feet. I don't really have to write that in to be specific.
Yeah, you would. Because I'm assuming that building constructors, you could argue that that's not a building or a structure. It's always better to be as specific as you can.
Well, it's the cranes that I know about that I could point out specifically have been sitting there. They're unregistered, unused equipment at this time. They're just sitting in other words, they become, if you limit the amount of equipment that is allowed to sit without registration within a yard, if you bring that down, because now it's totally out of control.
I think a lot of that equipment isn't registered. It's not DMV registered anyway. It doesn't.
Yeah.
Well, I know, but I mean, it's not operable, it's never moved.
I know, but it's not.
Been sitting there for years.
But saying it's not registered is not kind of a way of distinguishing.
Well, no,
it.
I'm not
Yeah.
saying that, I understand,
That's
but
true.
do you understand, I'm saying,
No, I
if
understand,
it's
yeah.
sitting there and isn't moved for, 5 years, and there's just one other point, and I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
That's okay.
All right. One other point, while I think about it, because you triggered it when you said it, and or maybe you all would say this, well, I mean, I go back, I've lived in this town over 30 years, and I go back to two full-time zoning enforcement officers that we had. One was Don Lane, and the other one was Eric Knapp. And, it was always, the thing was, and I got many people, some of the people who were involved, this gentleman right here, whose property, that he can see that from, that's his back fence. They said, well, we'll file a complaint. Make out an application, file a complaint, okay? Well, filing a complaint doesn't get anywhere. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. And I'm going through 2 full-time zoning enforcement officers, and nothing happened. So,
On another point, I think what you'll find is that a lot of these are special exceptions, and they had to provide a site plan, and the property no longer represents anything that was on that site plan. And at some point, if they want to vary from that site plan dramatically, and in some cases it's pretty dramatic, then somehow or other you need to say the site plan is controlling. When you give us a site plan, if you want to do more than that, you need to put it on your site
That's the
plan.
basis for the inspection.
Right.
Right.
I think the inspection idea is great, and I'm sorry if if you think it's picking on contractor storage, there probably are others, but you got to start someplace.
Well,
And this is where you know
list
you've got a
reflection
problem.
Of problem areas, the list that's right on here. Home occupations, signs, sediment and erosion controls, motor vehicle sales and repairs, junkyards, storage of materials, equipment without permits, and prohibited uses.
And, well, some of those are clearly just basically enforcement, like kind of home occupation. They're usually, you know, you kind of slap something on them and they usually kind of behave themselves. Not always, but, and some of them are obviously more significant issues. So, well, can I ask you a question?
Surely.
Do you use statements of use as part of your, you do, okay. Yeah, I mean, those, I find those very helpful, particularly you could get pretty specific, like, you know, when just say contractors, you say, you'd put that on, utilizing these equipment and, you know, you make provisions for minor changes and that kind of thing.
We get very abbreviated answers.
Well, I suspected that might be the case, and that's just why I mentioned. You could, there was, you know, one case where somebody had one of these little asphalt making machines, and all of a sudden it appeared. And there was a neighborhood conflict, so, I mean, but that became the bone of contention. So they came in and they said, look, we're going to operate it from 3 a.m. to 7 a.m., whatever it is, and during certain months of the year, and it's going to require an average of 4 trucks a day, or something like that. So at least it was kind of nailed down and providing a level of comfort to both the owner, that he wasn't going to get bothered by the town and neighbors, as well as to the neighbors who knew now that it wasn't going to grow. So
We do that.
good. I'm asking a question. I haven't been on this that long, so I'm not quite sure.
I mean, if it's an existing, it seems to me, if it's an existing situation and it has developed, this is far beyond somebody putting in an application for putting in a particular facility or whatever. This has gone far beyond that. So something has to be done to address the existing
Oh, absolutely.
situations.
And it has to be, inspection has to be recurrent, it has to be regular. That's what led me towards the licensing sort of direction. And it doesn't require a changing of the regulations. I mean, you can change, you can't change the regulations on existing use, that's the problem. It's very, very difficult.
Not
But
zoning.
By zoning, but
Right.
you can by that's why towns have gone the licensing route.
Right.
Not only that, but you can make the license, the applicant pay the cost of the inspection.
Right, and also, but I think our attorney, John Lambert, who's not with us, I mean, he's with us, but he's not here, had said at the, yeah. geez.
Thanks for clarifying.
I know, because he has been ill, and I'm sorry to say that. But I remember at the meeting where John was there, this is the last meeting that we had, that John said something about, he was the one that was talking about the blight. He started to talk about it, he had talked to me about industrial blight and how you could do something. There's another route there to add to the blight issue, the industrial blight issue. You can add something within that, which would affect existing situations.
Yeah, you take it outside the zoning.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm,
That seems to me as a basic principle that we have to follow, because it's the only way we can deal with it. Really existing and approved uses, they can be inspected up to the limits of what they stated, and that's it. What they stated as the use, and that's it. Nothing beyond that.
I think a real start, though, would be when you do have a CEO, is you ask them to take the site plans that were approved and compare them to what's there now. And if they think they exceed them considerably, they have to come back with a new site plan. And, you know, you can revisit it, but it was approved, and what is there was not what was intended.
I have a question about something you brought up, Brian. This idea of licensing, could this be in part licensing of junkyards along with this new idea of designating a junkyard wherever there's like a demonstrable problem? Or are we talking about licensing of like all sorts of different uses and so on?
Well, I was speaking specifically about a junkyard, but you don't, but you define a junkyard as any area where there's accumulation of rubbish, inoperable equipment, and prohibit that. And you can make an extension of somebody's yard for keeping, an old lawnmower thing. But you define that and you require that, you prohibit it from some areas, and you set standards for it. And you either do a license or you start prohibiting it.
Or you can say that somebody's changed the use of that property from the approved use to a junkyard.
Well, that's, yeah, I mean, so that's how you slide it
That's
into
a
the
back door.
zoning, yeah. So, I mean, there's all sorts of nuances. You're talking about
Yeah.
a whole toolkit here.
This one here, picture here, would be an example of, and I don't know the answer, that would be an example that is slid into,
Something.
something slid into a
What's all
junkyard.
this in the back?
These are all cars.
But this is a definable example.
Yeah, and this is another, these are more cars, but this, you can't see this here, but there's, behind the building here, there's huge piles of trash. When I
Yeah.
say trash, it's like industrial waste.
When you say
and-
why a car is part of a contractor's yard? I mean,
Well, this isn't a contractor's yard.
Oh,
This
this-
this is designated as an auto salvage yard, I believe.
Well, a junkyard.
And it was a non-conforming, prior non-conforming.
Well, see, that's one
But
way
it
you.
has grown to expand.
They're not supposed to expand a non-conforming use, but they clearly do.
Those are also regulated by Department of Motor Vehicles too. You might, some of this stuff does encounter state regulation.
We've
I'm not sure they're much quicker, but.
Well, and I also know that there's certain areas that we could look at on some of these properties where there is a wetlands impaction on that
It's
particular
called
thing too.
DEP,
Yeah, there's a couple of areas that we know that
Yeah.
exists.
or Rankin Lenders or whatever.
Yeah, well, I'm looking for things that my agency can do. But we certainly, when we write something, we can include the responsibilities of other agencies in terms of.
Well, you don't even have to. I think the awareness that, just because you're not making something illegal doesn't mean it's not illegal. There are other levels. It might not be violating Army Corps regulations for all I know. But I think, yeah, you want as much latitude over it as is appropriate for the town of Clinton. The state has their other concerns. I'm just suggesting that it might be for some more egregious things.
I think there's a lot of merit to looking at the junkyard definitions in general, because that's another area. They're classical areas where you collect materials or collect cars or vehicles, unregistered, particularly unregistered vehicles. Nobody wants to pay the taxes, so they don't register the vehicles, and they lose the incentive to use them.
Well, when you
And
start
they
seeing the
stay and
weeds
stay
growing
and stay.
around them, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, then
Yeah, I think everybody's had something like that nearby.
Just a point of clarification, I saw something on the, one of the blogs, but, the objective here is not to push businesses out of Clinton. The objective is to make them good neighbors. Good fences make good neighbors, good regulations make good neighbors, and for them to behave the way they would like it if it was next to where they live. And that would be a pretty high standard, I think, for most of them, which I think they'd acknowledge they're not meeting in most cases.
Anybody else have any suggestions?
Diane was here, but I think she did. Yeah, I don't know what happened there. I wanted Diane was here for, Diane lives on Beach Road Extension. We had gone through some, that's one of the
Yeah,
affected areas. But I don't know why, maybe she wasn't feeling well or something, because I did speak with her today and she was going to come here, so.
I can't explain why people aren't here. As I
Well,
said,
we certainly
I
can.
contacted the
It's a
representative.
rather common condition.
Common condition, yeah. I spoke to many people, and again, everybody's, you know, everybody's got busy lives. And, you know, it's great that you are giving your time to be this here, and we certainly all appreciate that, because we certainly will continue, we're gonna continue to pursue this until we...
Hopefully we'll resolve the ZEO issue shortly. I'm actually designated as a member of the selection committee for ZEO.
I
And
see.
I must say, I've learned a lot.
Do we have a good prospect?
I don't know who the prospects are.
Do you use Casio at all?
Pardon me?
Casio, Connecticut Association.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, thank you, I guess.
Thank you.
Yes, thank
You know,
you.
I'm used to people not showing up around this time of year because I know they're at the beach, but we're already at the beach, so I don't know.
And,
Well, you're welcome to take those pictures, and I have plenty more of what they
you
think.
know, I've seen these pictures.
Well, some of them I don't think you have. Some of them are newer, and actually we have some newer ones too. But, yeah,
Make them part of the record of the committee.
please do. Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't identify. I just got, you know, didn't get a chance
That's
to
okay.
put identification on them,
And this is an informal process. We're going to make a recommendation to the Planning and Zoning Commission, and basically it would be guidelines to give to the professionals to draft the regulation. You know, this is beyond the scope of volunteers to draft the regulations. I mean, that's what's happened. That's one of the reasons the regulations aren't always as tight as they should be.
Well, the regulation that you had, and that you now have again because it was thrown back, was not an awful regulation. But it did require enforcement, and the minute it started getting enforced, it got pushed back in some very ugly ways. And
but it was much too loose. It was much too...
so I can understand why it might be hard to keep a ZEO, and at some point, that's something that planning and zoning has to address to the ZEO, that you've got their back. If someone's trying to push them around, they have a means of saying, hey, hold it, this is not right, and calling them on it.
It was a pleasure meeting you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Brian's going to be working with us too, so just wanted you all to know that, of course.
You have the card?
I do.
This video provided as a public service by Kirk Carr, the Kirkster. Thank you for watching.